All right. Hello, everybody. It looks like we've got about 50 people who have joined us so far. We are going to give folks just a few more minutes to join and get settled. And in the meantime, please go ahead and let us know your name, where it is that you're calling from. And then for bonus points, you can let us know what it is that attracted you to join our event this evening. Hello, Kathy from Vienna. Manuel is here because he's interested in the connection between food and environment. We have Angela from ASU, a journalist student. Hello. And Manuel is a sushi sous chef. How cool. We have our very own Lauren Burns here, who's calling in from Corvallis. She's part of our media and marketing team at the Planetary Health Collective. Jessica here from Orlando, Jenny from Pittsburgh, Alexis from Georgia. Very international crowd. Hello, Louise from Manchester. Hello, everybody. Veronica from the Netherlands, an international law student. Amazing. Andrew from the UK with a PhD in sustainable diets. Amazing. Maddie from Maryland, working in sustainability and interested in food justice. So excited to have you. Fabulous. Jamie from Texas, Carla from Charlotte, North Carolina, who's interested in the relationship between food and the planet. Love it. So happy to have you all here. Cecily from Chicago. Sanam from Scotland. Amazing. Wow. Oh no. Okay. Stacy from Daytona Beach. Okay. All right, everybody. Just continue to go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat. We are just going to get started. So my name is Aiten Salahi. I am the founder and executive director of the Planetary Health Collective. And welcome to our first ever webinar and our inaugural event for the PHC. We are so excited to have you here. We had originally anticipated there only being 100 spots for this event, but we ended up hitting 600 registrations. And we are just so excited for all of you who joined us today for this very timely and important topic. Today, we are joined by Sujatha Bergen of the Natural Resources Defense Council and Stephanie Feldstein from the Center for Biological Diversity, who are going to be talking to us about how to eat for the climate. Our very own Mary Purdie of the Planetary Health Collective, our Director of Education, will also be providing us with a talk on the role of the nutrition practitioner in promoting planetary health. And the way today is going to be going is we're going to just start off by setting some ground rules for how the meeting is going to work. I'm going to introduce you all to the Planetary Health Collective, and then we're going to dive into our talk on how to eat for the climate with Sujatha, Stephanie, and Mary. So we will have a Q&A session at the very end of all three of Sujatha, Stephanie, and Mary's speaking today. So hold on to your questions until that point, and if you do have any burning questions that you want to make sure you do not forget, as we go, you can always send them into the chat, and we will be doing our best to moderate those questions and get to as many as we possibly can during the Q&A session. And we'll close out the day with Greta Ahlstrom, our Director of Operations at the Planetary Health Collective, offering 6 ways that you can all get involved with the Planetary Health Collective. So some norms and etiquette for today. Please make sure that your line is muted at all times. If you have not yet introduced yourself in the chat, please let us know your name, where you're from, and what attracted you to join us for this event tonight. As always, practice respect. The PHC is committed to creating a safe, diverse, and identity-affirming space. So any kind of harassment will result in immediate removal, but I know this is not going to be a problem with this crowd. We encourage you all to participate, and that could look like responding to questions that we have throughout the presentation in the chat box. And lastly, we are still accepting donations. So if you have not yet donated to the event and you would still like to, we will be sending out a PayPal link that you can submit your donations to in the chat box right now. We also would love for all of you to complete a survey that we've put together. It will only take you 2 minutes to complete, and it's basically our way of just getting to know you guys better and learning about how we can better serve you and our community. So the best part of this is that you're also going to be immediately entered into a chance to win free sustainable kitchen gear, which who doesn't want that? You'll be getting a dish brush, a dish block, and reusable silicone food covers. So fill out the 2-minute survey, which is going to be going into our chat box right now. You'll be entered for a giveaway for 3 zero waste kitchen essentials, and then just look out for an email from us to find out if you won. Even if you don't want these sustainable kitchen essentials, please go ahead and fill out the survey. It would mean the whole world to us. And without further ado, drum roll, welcome to the Planetary Health Collective, everybody. Again, my name is Aiten Salahi. I'm founder and executive director of the PHC, and we are a movement to mitigate climate change and nourish human health by leveraging the unique role of food and nutrition professionals and consumers in the fight. So our mission is to activate, incubate, and elevate the leadership potential of food and nutrition professionals who are committed to using their practice and platform to cultivate a more just, regenerative, and climate resilient future for all. We want to provide our community with an unparalleled opportunity to channel their unique passions and skills to have a meaningful contribution in the food and climate fight. If you are part of this session, that means that you are part of our community. Welcome to the PHC. And we are all here because we are joined by the belief that human health is inseparable from the stewardship of Earth's natural systems. Our health is not distinct from the health of our planet, and we believe that food is the single strongest lever to optimize both. We believe that food and nutrition professionals are uniquely positioned to educate healthcare practitioners and consumers and to also influence public policy. But what has to happen before all of that is we have to know how to connect the dots between food and the environment, and we have to do it in an intersectional way. Intersectional nutrition education for and by nutrition professionals must draw on those connections between human and environmental health, social and climate justice to leverage our unique position to have a meaningful impact in the fight against the climate crisis. So all of this put together, our hope is to arm food and nutrition professionals with the knowledge, community, and opportunities to engage meaningfully. And we hope to build an active and competent coalition of leaders who can bridge health practice to social and environmental justice, and remember to center the communities that are most impacted. So since this is our first year as an organization, we've set up a few goals, and I want to thank all of you who have registered for this event for already helping us to work towards our first goal, which is to build community. We want to formalize partnerships with existing organizations, campaign with allied organizations, and spotlight those groups. And now is your first chance to participate in the chat. If you would like to provide us with some feedback, we would like to know what types of community benefits would be most valuable for you as a member of the Planetary Health Collective. What are some organizations that you would like to see the PHC partner with? So you can take a minute and send those responses into the chat. Our second goal is to build educational assets for our community. We want to establish a core curriculum so that everybody who is part of the Planetary Health Collective community knows the basics of how to connect food and climate. We want to provide our community members with a leadership academy where they can learn how to become an organizer in this space and to have a greater impact on a broader scale. We also want to be able to provide you guys with some high value resources via email. So if you don't have time to tap into all of these other resources we're creating, you can get just the highlights via our email. And here's another question for you guys. What educational assets would be the most valuable for you to bring planetary health into your professional work? Go ahead and respond in the chat box. We really will be looking at all of these things to inform how we're going to approach our year one strategic goal. So please do go ahead and respond in the chat, and thank you for doing so. Our third goal here is to maximize organizational diversity. As a new organization, it is absolutely essential to us that anti-racist principles and structures make it into our foundation. We want to have diversity-driven recruitment efforts and elevate people of all communities and all walks of life into leadership on the PHC. Another question for you guys. what suggestions do you have to the PhD to build anti-oppression into our foundation? So of course, these are big questions. So if you think of some responses as we go throughout the session today, please feel free to just go ahead and send those in the chat, and we will be reviewing all of those. And for now, the PhD has resolved to educate 1,000 food and nutrition professionals on the intersections of food, climate, and health practice in the year 2021. And we're envisioning doing that by building out a leadership academy, continuing along with a webinar series, not unlike the one that we're conducting right now, and also developing roundtable discussions around the more complicated and contentious topics in the food and climate movement, so that we can all learn how to navigate those stickier and more complicated conversations in a way that is evidence-based. So if any or all of this is resonating with you, I would encourage you to just stay tuned till the very, very end of our session today. Bretta is going to be closing out the session to let you all know 6 ways that you can get involved with the PHC, and we are always looking for more volunteers or leaders who can join us at the Planetary Health Collective. Without further ado, I will turn it over to Sujatha and Stephanie to teach us how to eat for the climate. Thanks, y'all.
Hi, everyone. Sorry, that took a second. I'm Stephanie Feldstein with the Center for Biological Diversity. Thank you all for joining us, and we're really excited to be part of this kickoff event, especially because, as we were just talking about, that the way that planetary health and human health is intertwined is really at the center of so much of the food work that we do. Today, we're going to talk about the environmental impacts of meat and dairy production, particularly looking at it at every stage, and what you can do to help transform our food system into one that's healthier for people and the planet. And the reason we're focusing on meat and dairy, which many of you may already know this, but it's because although there are environmental impacts associated with agriculture in general, meat and dairy cause far more damage than other foods. When it comes to climate change, for example, meat and dairy production accounts for nearly half of all agricultural emissions. And if we're just looking at beef alone, beef requires about 20 times more land and emits 20 times more greenhouse gas emissions than common plant-based proteins like beans. And many of the other impacts we'll talk about are really specific to the presence of livestock. A lot of times when we think about the impact of livestock production, sometimes people really only think about that middle stage where it's actually the animals, whether they're on the field, in the factory farm, or thinking about the crops that they're fed. And that is a huge part of the environmental impact, but the impact on the environment, and particularly the climate, starts well before that, with the first stage where the land is cleared for making space for all of those feed crops or for the actual animals themselves to graze or be raised. And then there is, of course, that main part where the animals themselves are out there, and that requires all kinds of inputs, not just the crops, all the pesticides and water and the soil impacts that go into raising those crops, and the impact of the presence of the animals where they're grazing, and the climate impacts of the animals themselves and the methane that's released, particularly from ruminants like cattle. And then finally, there's that final stage, which is at the end of the life for the livestock, but there are still a lot of environmental impacts happening there, where the animals are transported to slaughter facilities. There's a lot of energy and water input that happens with slaughter and processing the meat, and then from there getting it to market, which for these products typically requires refrigeration and other additional energy inputs like that. And all in all, that's to say that this is a very inefficient way to get food from farm to fork. So to dig into some of that a little bit more, let's start with talking about that first stage of land use and deforestation. And you can go to the next slide. So when the land is cleared in order to either make room for feed crops or for grazing, we're losing the natural carbon sinks that forests and grasslands provide. And I know that there's been quite a lot of talk about carbon sequestration and whether or not cattle are able to sequester carbon, but recent studies have shown that even when there are benefits of cattle being able to sequester some carbon in the soil, it's pretty much all canceled out by the damage that's been done to the original grasslands that were there. So in other words, these natural areas are far more effective at sequestering carbon than anything that the presence of livestock can do. And it's not just about worsening climate change, but it's also destroying these irreplaceable ecosystems and displacing indigenous people who also live in these areas as well. Another thing that we often see when it comes to land use and deforestation particularly when it comes to cattle grazing, is they'll say, well, it's an area where cattle should be grazed because it's not suitable for growing crops. And of course, that ignores the value of the land as habitat, as carbon sinks, and as well as the place where people live. So another point on deforestation, Sujatha is going to talk a bit more about the Amazon, but if we can just go back to that, to the deforestation slide. A lot of times we think about the Amazon, but here in the US, one example is there's 7.4 million acres of this pinyon juniper forest, and that's what's pictured there. And that's an area that's larger than the state of Vermont, that's targeted by the Bureau of Land Management for destruction, just to make it easier for cattle to graze there. And these are regional old growth trees. A lot of people aren't familiar with them, but they're very important to the West. They provide habitat for more than 70 species of wildlife. They provide vegetative cover to protect important watersheds out in that arid region, and it's an important indigenous food source. And globally, another recent analysis of 20,000 wildlife species found that 88% of them will lose habitat to farmland by 2050. And again, a lot of this farmland is going to be going toward feed crops or livestock. So now we can go to the next slide. When we get into that kind of second stage of production, when the land has already been cleared and we're now growing the crops for the cattle, a big part of that has to do with irrigation. And although irrigation is not a direct cause of climate change the same way that deforestation is, it does worsen climate impacts that are associated with rising temperatures and drought. And of course, when there's not enough water, it harms wildlife, it harms humans, and it harms our ability to continue growing nutritious food. And one huge example of this is 23% of all water consumption in the United States goes toward just irrigating feed crops for cattle in the Western United States. So just cattle in the Western region take up 23% of US water consumption. And when you look at those feed crops for cattle, the impact that that has on some of the local watersheds, that takes up 55% of the water in the Colorado River Basin. And that's a really important river basin in the US. It provides water for major cities like Phoenix, Las Vegas, and even cities far outside the basin like Denver, San Diego, and Los Angeles. So that has a huge impact on human water supplies, as well as obviously the ecosystems around those rivers. So that's a huge amount of water from these natural areas that are going into these feed crops. And cattle feed alone is the leading driver of flow depletion for 1/3 of the Western watersheds in the US. So there's just a huge impact from the amount of water that's needed. In looking at California, I know, a lot of times there have been questions about how much water almond takes and whether almond milk is better or worse. But the top 2 out of 3 water users in California are pasture land and alfalfa, which is grown as a feed crop primarily for the dairy industry. And the pasture irrigation uses about 2.7 trillion gallons of water a year. So again, it's just huge amounts of water input that's going into meat and dairy production. And we can go to the next slide. So to talk a bit about the focus on climate change. So livestock production globally is responsible for a little more than 16% of greenhouse gas emissions. But out of that, 41% of that is just from beef alone. So again, it's a huge amount of emissions that are coming from livestock production. And also the type of emission is really important here because a lot of what's coming from animal agriculture is methane. And methane it's a short-lived climate pollutant. So it's significantly more potent than carbon dioxide, but it only stays in the atmosphere for a shorter amount of time. But what that means is that when methane increases, as it has been over the past few decades, that means that we are rapidly increasing the short-term effects on climate change. But on the flip side of that means that when we work toward reducing meat and dairy consumption and production and reducing the amount of methane that's being put into the atmosphere, we can help give a boost toward the climate action that's needed, toward the long-term emissions reductions by quickly getting some of that methane out of the atmosphere. So this is a really key point on just how important these dietary shifts are when it comes to fighting climate change, especially when we're looking at the next decade, which is the deadline that scientists have given us of saying that, well, we have until about 2030 to cut greenhouse gas emissions in half in order to avoid the worst effects of climate change. So this is a really key way to do it. And we've also seen a lot of studies in recent years showing that we can't meet those emissions reduction goals if we don't address what we eat. You can go to the next slide. So I already mentioned a little bit at the beginning that, in that final stage of production where there's the transportation and the slaughter and the transport, that there's a lot of water and energy inputs that go into that. There's also a lot of pollution from, particularly at the slaughter phase, from what is left behind during slaughter and from the carcass disposal. And it's pretty much as nasty as it sounds, but that is kind of a key point that's often overlooked in terms of the environmental impact of meat production. A few of the other things that I just want to quickly mention is when we look at the environmental laws, livestock production pollutants are currently exempt from the Clean Air Act. So that means that other industries that are responsible for monitoring and restricting certain air pollutants, the livestock industry doesn't have to do any of that, even though they're responsible for many of those same pollutants. There are also a lot of Clean Water Act exemptions that happen in the livestock production industry. And the EPA has estimated that about 40% of US waterways are impaired by livestock manure. When it comes to soil health, overgrazing from cattle in particular leads to erosion and it destroys brittle vegetation. Around the world, it's been found that about 73% of the land that's being grazed suffers from some form of degradation. So that means that there are more than 6 billion acres on the planet that have been harmed in some way just by livestock grazing. The crops that are grown to feed livestock, they're typically those monoculture crops that we hear a lot about that are horrible for the soil, that are often drenched in pesticides, that are also the cause of a lot of destruction of habitat, particularly when we're looking at the U.S. Particularly, we see in the middle of the country, it's just totally changed the landscape and ecosystems there. And finally, as a wildlife conservation organization, of course, I have to talk about some of the direct threats to wildlife associated with livestock production. There are more than 1 million native animals that are killed each year by wildlife services. That is this secretive program that's within the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and they essentially exist to kill wildlife. Much of that happens at the behest of ranchers, and they kill wildlife, including wolves, coyotes, birds, river otters, and even they target tens of thousands of prairie dogs each year because the burrows are considered to create a risk for grazing cattle, that they might step in the burrows and injure themselves. And there's also risks associated with disease transmission. There are some diseases that can be passed from animals like cattle and sheep to wildlife like bison and bighorn sheep. And with the next slide, I just want to emphasize it's really hard to overstate how little biodiversity and ecosystem health are valued when it comes to livestock production. Because with this example, grasshoppers are killed in order to save grass for cows to eat them. So from the tiniest grasshopper up to bison and wolves, the full range of biodiversity is affected by livestock production, and often in fatal ways. And as we've often seen before, when one species is injured, it can have this cascading effect on the ecosystem. And that, of course, again, affects not only those animals and biodiversity, but our own health and our ability to have the healthy planet that we need to continue growing food. And with the next slide, I just want to reiterate that all of these impacts, they not only present threats to the climate and to wildlife, but also, of course, to human health via water pollution, the impacts of climate change, pesticide exposure, and our ability to grow nutritious food. And oftentimes we see, we have these extinction facts labels, and in comparing to the nutrition facts labels, oftentimes the foods that are labeled as highest concern when it comes to wildlife and the environment are also highest concern when it comes to human health. And we'll talk a little bit more in a bit about kind of what the ideal solution for people on the planet looks like, and how we can go about making that happen. But first, I'm going to turn it over to Sujatha to talk a little bit more about some of the international impacts that we've seen.
Thanks so much, Stephanie, for that great 101 introduction to the issues we'll be covering. Thank you so much for having me. It's exciting to be part of the Planetary Health Collective launch, and also to have such an international crowd joining us. I'm going to talk briefly about two case studies of the impact of our reliance on industrial meat production systems that produce mass quantities of meat around the world. And I wanted to focus in on the Amazon because it's a part of the world that has captured the imagination of so many and was recently in the news quite a bit due to an increase in fires over the past several years. And what people don't know often is that the destruction of the Amazon is very much connected to meat consumption, to satisfy high demand for meat, especially both beef and chicken. So let's see. So just a few facts on the Amazon. It's the largest tropical rainforest in the world. It currently prevents an estimated 2 billion tons of carbon from entering the atmosphere each year and fueling global warming. And 1 in 10 known species on the planet lives in the Amazon. And according to the Yale School of Forestry, 62% of the area that has been cleared in the Amazon and destroyed portions of this precious ecological treasure, 62% of the cleared land in the Amazon is used for cattle grazing. And that phenomenon is on the rise. In fact, the United Nations estimates that the number of cattle in the Amazon basin increased from approximately 5 million in the 1960s to 70 to 80 million in the 2000s. And so what you have is small scale farmers that are clearing land in order to graze cattle. But these cattle are then sold up a chain and end up being processed and exported by mega corporations. For example, JBS, which is the largest meat processor and butcher in the world, and one of the largest companies in the world. And due to the enormous deforestation and climate impacts linked to its supply chain, JBS is also one of the largest climate polluters in the world. In addition to cattle, soy, which is largely used to feed chickens, pigs, and cows in Brazil and the European Union is another culprit. Brazil is one of the world's largest exporters of soy, and 13% of its crop is grown in the Amazon. So that's a brief summary of the connection between meat production on a vast scale and the destruction of one of our ecological treasures. You can go to the next slide. The other case study I wanted to mention is, I think, particularly timely given all of our being consumed with the COVID-19 pandemic this past year. So antibiotics are an essential part of modern medicine. They allow an ear infection not to become deadly. They allow organ transplants. It's really hard to overestimate how important they have been to extending human life since World War II, when they started being used on a wide scale. Unfortunately, the nature of antibiotics is if they are used on a wide scale and overused, they can create resistant bugs, resistant bacteria. So bacteria are very good at mutating and coming up with ways to get around drugs that are meant to kill them. And so the more you use antibiotics, the more resistant bugs are produced. And unfortunately, we use way more antibiotics across the world than we need to. And much of this is in livestock production. In fact, globally, 73% of all antimicrobials are used in animals raised for food, 73%. And what's really upsetting is that it's not necessary to use these antibiotics. Animals grow without antibiotics. The reason they're used, though, is because we crowd so many animals onto small pieces of land in unhygienic conditions, in situations where they would never occur naturally. And so we have to feed them drugs to allow them to not get sick. In addition, the goal of the industry is to grow them as quickly as possible, the animals. And so when you feed them antibiotics, they spend less time fighting off infection and more time growing. And so it's a huge problem in the United States and internationally as well. And I wanted to just talk about one example of where this has emerged as a huge problem, which is in China. China consumes roughly half the planet's pigs, and they produce 618 billion kilograms of manure each year. And antibiotics use in this industry is rampant. It's very unregulated and has been linked to antibiotics contained in their manure, which is excreted, and then makes its way into the waterways of the country. And so testing has found vast quantities of bacteria that are resistant to antibiotics in waterways in China. And China is not the only place that this is a problem. It's probably the biggest problem, but a recent study found hotspots growing throughout the world on animal farms. So northeastern India, northern Pakistan, Iran, eastern Turkey, south coast of Brazil, Egypt, Red River Delta in Vietnam, areas surrounding Mexico City and Johannesburg. So this is a global problem and is tied to our system of industrially producing meat to supply this mass demand for meat across the world. And I'm going to pass it back to Stephanie now to talk about solutions. I think we're finished depressing you.
Hopefully. Yeah, the exciting part is that we know what the solution is, and and that it's something that's already available to us. Really, to put it succinctly, plant-forward diets are the solution to this problem. I do want to talk for a second, though, about regenerative agriculture, because I know there's a lot of buzz about that right now. And there are obviously better and worse ways to raise livestock. And there are some really valuable, values at the core of regenerative agriculture, things like promoting soil health and increasing biodiversity. And all of that is ultimately where we need to go. And we could have a whole separate webinar talking about kind of what the state of regenerative agriculture is, and where are there concerns on how it's defined and how it's implemented, because it's at a point now where there's a great risk of greenwashing around it because it's not super well defined. But the main thing that I want to focus on here with it is that even under the ideal systems, we still need to focus on reducing meat and dairy consumption and production, because it's simply not possible to take our current diet and switch it over to a totally regenerative system. There was one study that came out a couple years ago that found that existing pasture land in the United States could only support 27% of our current beef supply in a grass-fed system. And that's not even a regenerative system, that's just a pure grass-finished system. And so it's only a small fraction of the beef supply that could actually be supported under one of these systems. And also that in that system, the total greenhouse gas emissions in the United States would wind up increasing by 8%, because there would need to be more cattle, because it takes longer to grass finish cattle as opposed to using feedlots and that sort of thing. So there are a lot of dynamics to keep in mind here, but the main thing, and the one that we're going to really focus on here, is plant-forward diets, because by reducing meat and dairy production and consumption, we are able to make these regenerative systems more possible and to make sure that they are actually sustainable. So on the next slide, I want to talk a little bit about the role of individuals. The exciting thing when it comes to food is that individuals have quite a lot of power. When it comes to addressing climate change through energy, for example, it's a little bit harder as individuals for us to make day-to-day decisions that have a meaningful impact. Because, you know, when I turn on the lights in a room, I don't get to decide where that energy comes from. That's decided by my utility, and most of us are under monopoly utilities. And they decide whether or not renewable energy is even available in the area. And there's a whole slew of laws that decide whether or not it would be affordable for me to have rooftop solar, you know, whether I'm in a place where that would even be effective and all of that. So it's really hard with energy to have those day-to-day decisions, but with food, every time we sit down to eat, we get to make a choice on what kind of food system we want to support with our meals. And our individual choices, they not only align our values and what we want to see out of the world with our actions, but they can influence the community around us. It can lead to collective action, and it can influence the market, which, you know, again, kind of trickles back to creating that demand that determines what is being grown. There are other factors in there as well around, you know, policies that, you know, that influence what's grown. But as we shift the market, that winds up having a huge influence on policy, even when we're up against powerful lobbyists like we are when it comes to food issues. But I also want to acknowledge the limitations of individual choice, because not everybody has the same ability to make choices. Our choices are defined by what's available on menus, what's available in grocery stores, in our neighborhoods. It's available by the cost of food, by social and cultural norms, which are a really powerful influence, and our understanding of nutrition and healthy diets. And that can include things like, you know, actually understanding what makes a healthy meal, as well as how to cook with different types of foods and how to prepare them and how to feed our families. So this is a place where you all in particular in the nutrition community have a massive amount of influence to help people overcome these barriers, as well as advocate for policies that can help make these sustainable foods more accessible and more equitable for everybody. And so I want to talk a little bit about some of the policies that impact diet. So go to the next slide. And again, I want to emphasize the opportunities and the importance for folks in the nutrition community to get involved in this issue, because you're in a great position to really align health from, you know, the personal perspective and as a policy priority. You are credible spokespeople for your clients as well as for policymakers, and you're influencers in this sphere. And so that's really important when it comes to the policy interventions. So just to talk through a couple of these policies that influence diet. This is not, by no means an exhaustive list, but just to give a sense of what some of the factors are out there. The first one is the Dietary Guidelines for Americans. And many of you may already know this, but the dietary guidelines, and not just in the US, but national dietary guidance around the world, has the same effect, where most people may not think about that dietary guidance or the government's recommendations every time they sit down to eat, but they have a massive influence over the purchasing programs for schools, for governments and hospitals. They also have a huge influence over what is available for people to eat, from young kids getting school food up to seniors who may be part of Meals on Wheels programs, to folks in prisons and the military and who work for the government. I mean, it's a huge influence on what's actually put in front of people day to day, as well as all of those meals add up to a lot of direct market spending. But another important piece that's directly aligned with the nutrition education that many of you may be working on is that the dietary guidelines also influence the way that we think about nutrition overall. So even if we're not thinking about them at every meal, they do change the way that people think about what's healthy and what's not. And unfortunately, at least here in the United States, the dietary guidelines are not aligned at all with federal funding. There's a lot more funding and subsidies that goes toward meat and dairy production than goes towards the fruits and vegetables and other plant-based foods that the guidelines say that we should be eating. Another place where we can have a lot of influence is in school food. And while the dietary guidelines are a piece of that, there's also a whole slate of policies on the federal, state, and local level that determine what is going into schools, and things that have to do with how much money is spent per per meal, per child, the state of the kitchens, like are the schools even prepared to be able to prepare and serve different types of food, whether there are plant-based options that are offered in schools or not. All of these things happen at all different levels. So there are a lot of different ways to engage on school food. And then another area is climate action plans. Even though, as we've been discussing, food and agriculture have a huge impact on climate change, they haven't shown up very much yet in terms of climate policy. We've been doing a lot of work to change that, and we're starting to see a little bit of movement. But right now, most climate action plans do not include anything about food and agriculture. But those plans are an opportunity for, for cities and counties, as well as institutions that may have them, to promote and support local agriculture, to measure the climate impact of food and agriculture in their areas, and to acknowledge the role of diets in climate change. And one thing that can show up in climate action plans, but also is often passed as individual policies, are things that promote plant-based options. Things like Meatless Mondays, or there is a motion that was recently proposed in Los Angeles that would require having a plant-based option at all restaurants in government buildings, as well as major entertainment venues and airports and that sort of thing. And what that does is that by promoting these plant-based options, it helps not only to increase the availability of those options for people, but also to help normalize the idea of plant-based eating. And that's a really important part in creating these widespread diet shifts, is having people accept and enjoy the plant-based foods that they're eating. And then the last area that we'll highlight is around corporate commitments and institutional purchasing. These big companies and institutions like schools and hospitals have huge potential and huge influence over the market and what's available. And I'll pass it back to Sujatha to talk a little bit more about that.
Great, thanks, Stephanie. I spend much of my time working on market-oriented solutions, changing the purchasing of institutional menus. And the first thing I do when I go and talk with folks like this, you can go ahead and do the little animation, which honestly I included in the slide accidentally. I'm not that sophisticated PowerPoint, but the point I first want to make is, what does a climate healthy menu look like? And the most important thing to remember, it's not a piece of iceberg lettuce and a crouton, which is unfortunately what has been provided, sold as plant-forward food on menus, at least in the United States, for a long time. Fortunately, that is starting to change, and chefs and food companies are realizing that for a dish to be delicious and exciting, it doesn't have to be completely meat-centric. And, I don't know if we have people from all over the world, but in the United States, there is a certain amount of status historically and cultural significance placed on this huge hunk of steak in the middle of your plate, surrounded maybe by a little bit of potato and peas. And so that is what we are encouraging institutions to shift away from. And as you can see from some of these photos, these plant-forward dishes can be really awesome and exciting and new. And I don't want to pretend that it's a little, I think, presumptuous to act like, that this is just being discovered now. I mean, many cultures have developed plant-forward menus over centuries and thousands of years. And one of the strategies you can use in developing a climate-healthy menu is actually to look at dishes and diets made in other parts of the world that just naturally use less meat, use it as a condiment, and using and moving it from the center of the plate. So strategies that can be used include just straight plant-based options. And if you don't know if you don't have a whole list that come to your mind immediately, there are tons of resources online that have suggestions for delicious plant-based options that can substitute for everything from entrees to appetizers to desserts. You can also not go the whole way. If you want a little bit of meat, that's fine. What we're talking about here is not eliminating meat completely. I mean, you can do that, but for many people in the cultures you work in, that would be very difficult to advocate for to everyone. And so if you don't feel like you can advocate going that far, or you yourself don't want to go that far, you can start using meat as a condiment, as in some of these pictures. You can even do things like substitute mushrooms into ground meat recipes. And that's been done very successfully in the United States. It's called the blended burger. And it's in some places it's 50% mushroom, 50% beef. And in doing that, you can immediately cut your beef consumption by 50%. And then you can also reduce portion sizes and just move meat from the center of the plate. And I used to like to use the example of stir fries, Mongolian stir fries as an example. That's something that I like to eat, and you can, a little bit of meat in those things goes a long way. So I want to talk next about some success stories in adopting these strategies that we've seen in the market and among institutions. So if you can go to the next slide. So first I want to talk about higher education. So here in the United States, there are lots of examples of campuses adopting plant-forward options in on their campuses. So for example, the University of Connecticut, one of the largest college campuses in the country, has recently shifted all of their hamburgers to 50% mushroom, 50% beef burgers. And they've calculated that they're saving, the equivalent of thousands of cars, taking the equivalent of thousands of cars off the road a year through just this one simple switch. And even more exciting is they haven't gotten pushback from the student body. There's been no complaints. And in fact, the blended burger concept was developed at the Culinary Institute of America, and mushrooms actually add taste to an umami taste to a burger, and so students tend to really like them. And this blended burger has really been adopted on a wide scale on campuses in the United States. So UCLA is another campus that's done this, University of Colorado, lots of places. So that's one example. This is actually a photo of Cambridge, because I did want to give Europe, well, I guess not technically Europe, but the UK its due. Their higher education institutions have actually done a really, have started to be on the cutting edge of this movement. And in fact, Cambridge and Oxford have banned both beef and lamb. And in 2016, Cambridge replaced meat with plant-based products for in its 14 college outlets and 1,500 annual events, and calculated that switch alone has led to a 33% reduction in carbon emissions per kilogram of food purchased, and a 28% reduction in land per kilogram of food used. So that's exciting. I think there's a lot of great movement happening on college campuses around the world, and so this next generation is really leading the way. If you can go to the next slide. So these are two logos that you don't necessarily always associate with being on the cutting edge of healthy food trends, environmental food trends. But I did want to point out that there is a phenomenon happening of some of these fast food restaurants, which are so associated with meat, starting to adopt more plant-based options. And so Burger King in August 2019 included an Impossible Burger, which is a soy-based burger, no meat in it on its menu. And KFC did a plant-based chicken option that sold out, I think within days of being introduced in the United States. And they're actually they're debuting and then McDonald's is actually debuting a McPlant patty, which is pea-based, that the company Beyond Meat helped them develop as well. I mean, so I mention this mostly because it's such a mainstream trend. And what we need to see, and we need to see these companies do, is actually demonstrate that consumers are actually switching from the meat-based products on their menus to these options. And so we'd like to see these companies actually put effort and energy and marketing dollars into making that happen, and then also doing the studies necessary. But I think it is a great first step in mainstreaming the idea of a plant-based diet, which I think to many, at least Americans, is quite foreign. The idea that you can actually have a whole meal without having meat in it. All right, and then the last example is the food service industry. These are two companies that are actually, so Sodexo, Compass, and a third company, Aramark, are the second, third, and fourth largest sellers of meals in the United States, only behind McDonald's in terms of the number of people they feed, the number of meals they sell a day. And this industry has actually started to recognize the need to shift their menus. And one of the most encouraging developments is Sodexo, which is a French-based company, has committed to cut their overall greenhouse gas emissions by 34%. And recently, working with a set of NGOs, they calculated that 70% of the emissions in their supply chain are associated with buying animal products. So essentially, it's impossible for a food company to hit meaningful climate emissions reductions goals without cutting the volume of animal products that they purchase. And so the company recognized that in a statement they did, and said that they understand that addressing diet-related emissions will be required to meet their carbon target. And we are hoping that kind of commitment expands to the rest of the food service industry and then beyond. I really get discouraged hearing McDonald's, for example, talking about ambitious climate targets without talking at all about reducing the amount of beef it sells and buys. I think it's almost impossible for a food company that serves a lot of meat to meaningfully reduce their emissions without cutting their meat purchases. Compass, I wanted to mention also, they have a commitment to cut their beef purchases by 30%.
I know, can I just say one thing, please?
Hi, we're actually leaving questions until the end. So if you go ahead and put it in the chat, and I will take note of that, and we'll go ahead and continue on.
She might only accept that if.
And they'll be behind, they are behind meeting that target, but it is exciting to see one of the world's largest food service companies actually recognize that cutting their beef purchases is important to an overall sustainability strategy. So those are the examples that I've got, and I think Stephanie is going to bring us home with some calls to action that folks can take.
Thanks, Sujatha. Yeah, we wanted to leave you with a couple of actions so that you can start immediately to apply all of this into your world. The first one is on the individual level, is whether you're working with patients or clients or even in your own life. We added a tip sheet provided by the New York Times in here that just gives a really great way to help people visually connect between diet and the environment. So help the folks around you and the people that you're working with, especially in your capacity as a nutrition and diet expert, help them make that connection between diet and their health and environmental health, and the need to start making these shifts toward a more plant-forward way of eating. And then we also wanted to include, because as I talked earlier, there is this give and take between the individual action that has to happen and the collective action that has to happen to really transform our food system. And so a step that you can take immediately, building on what Sujatha was just talking about, is urge the local institutions that you're affiliated with to adopt climate-friendly menus, to start reducing their purchases of meat and dairy products and offering more plant-based items. And that could be schools, hospitals that you work with, the company you work for, or even just reaching out as a citizen to your city council and asking them to adopt Meatless Mondays, to think about their own procurement policies and to include this issue in their climate action plans. And if you need assistance with any of this, whether it is more information on the connection between diet and the environment, or technical assistance with how to get these local institutions and city councils to adopt these climate-friendly diet policies, our information is out there, and we encourage you to reach out to us, and we're happy to help.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Stephanie and Sujatha. Such an informative and empowering talk. We have a lot to think about. And I just want to echo a point that Stephanie made earlier in this presentation, that it is really important to realize the power that we have as individuals, but also the limitations and the impact that we can have when we are acting alone, and also the unfair pressure that puts on the individual to try to solve systemic issues that really require collective action. So that's part of what we're hoping to provide with the Planetary Health Collective, are some channels and some opportunities to develop skills around participating in collective action. So thank you again so much, Sujatha and Stephanie. For folks who are here on the call, you will have an opportunity to ask Stephanie and Sujatha all of your burning questions at the very end of the talk. If you have something in mind and you don't want to forget, you can go ahead and send it into the chat now, and we'll take note of that. And then Greta will be moderating our Q&A at the very end, and she will be doing her best to get to as many questions as we can in the amount of time that we have left. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Mary Purdie to tell us about the role of the nutrition practitioner in promoting planetary health. Take it away, Mary.
Thank you, Aitan, and thank you so much to Stephanie and Sujatha for just an incredible job of shedding so much light and practical application too, of helping us to understand what the issues are and how we can begin to change them. You can go to the next slide here, Aitan. And actually, let me just mention that I'm a dietitian. You can go back, Aitan. I'm a dietitian. I've been in clinical practice for close to 13 years, and I've worked with a variety of different patients and also speak and write and teach. But I wanted to mention how much of an integral role I truly believe nutrition professionals, whether you are in private practice or in healthcare in some way, or in any kind of institutional setting where you have an ability to interact with clients, patients, institutions, we have a tremendous role to play. And truly, I call myself an eco-dietitian because I believe that we can no longer separate environmental health from human health. And this is where we can come in and play an incredible role. So next slide. You might have been thinking, as you've been listening to Stephanie and Sujatha, okay, sustainability, environment, climate change. Well, what does this have to all do with human health, and what can we do? Well, a lot, especially if you are working in any aspect of the food and nutrition space. I know that there are some chefs out there. We know that there are some sustainable development goals from the United Nations. This is a universal call to action to end poverty, protect our planet, and make sure that everybody has a chance to enjoy peace and prosperity. And the goal is to have this happen by 2030, which if you haven't checked your calendar, is coming down the pike pretty darn soon. So if we are nutrition professionals, foodies in that space, we are concerned with human health, with human well-being. And we know that that human health and well-being is absolutely contingent upon protecting our environment, as well as reducing social inequities. Next slide, please. So if you have been in practice, and even if you haven't, you may be well aware of the fact that climate change is here. It has already had a tremendous negative impact on human health. And this is not just about the impact that it has had in faraway developing countries where there might be a greater incidence of things like malaria and dengue fever and cholera. It is happening in more developed countries as well. We're seeing this as practitioners manifesting in cardiovascular issues, in respiratory diseases, things like asthma, heat-related illnesses. We've seen with droughts and high heat temperatures that people have actually passed away as a result of the implications around this climate crisis and the impact it's having on people's health conditions. And we know that we have been a part of this as humans. Our participation has been well established. Next slide. And that is where the good news comes in. As Stephanie and Sujatha were saying, we have the power to help create change. And the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has indicated very, very strongly that when we engage in more sustainable diets, that is an incredible opportunity globally for us to reduce our greenhouse gases as well as to improve our health outcomes, which is exactly what we are hoping to do as those who care about the environment and also care about human health. Next slide. So I know that we talked a bit about the effects of our food system environmentally on our ecosystems and our ecological health and wellness, but I wanted to give the health argument as well. As nutrition professionals, we can come in as with nutrition expertise and human health wellness understanding to make sure that people know that things like monocultures, while they have an impact on the environment, there is also a direct correlation between less diverse diets and human health outcomes. So when people eat less diverse diets, there's fewer nutrients that are found in those foods. And as a result of those monocultures that are being created and grown, like soy and corn, very often the amount of those that are being grown has been directly correlated with the increase in those chronic health conditions that we're seeing, like diabetes and hypertension or high blood pressure, high cholesterol. In terms of fertilizers, we know the impact on the environment, but as it relates to health, absolutely, these fertilizers are polluting the air that people are breathing. They are contaminating water, very often in marginalized communities and communities of color. The impact on the soil affects the impact of the nutritional value of the food, which has an impact on human health. And lastly, what may not always be known or understood is the impact that fertilizers have on thyroid health. So that is something that we really need to, as practitioners, make the connection to when people don't often think of how fertilizers directly impact health. Same thing with pesticides. Obviously, a huge impact on the environment, but we know that pesticides can act as endocrine disruptors, playing a huge role in all kinds of chronic conditions that we see, from cardiovascular disease, diabetes, neurodegenerative diseases, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, even ALS. And there have been numerous studies to show that those who work directly with pesticides, whether they're mixing them or spraying them in the fields, there has been a higher incidence of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. So whether it's direct impact or whether it's indirect impact through those pesticide residues, the health implications are quite real and quite profound. Next slide. As Sujatha and Stephanie both mentioned, we are really concerned with industrial agriculture in terms of the impact that it has on the environment and on health. We know that people who live near CAFOs or concentrated animal feeding operations are having detrimental health issues related to the quality of their air, their water. These lead to diseases, and very often it's impacting in a much greater proportion marginalized communities. There's also antibiotic resistance, so that has implications for those of us who might need to go on antibiotics, and all of a sudden we're not able to fight off those diseases that would normally be eradicated with antibiotics because of the resistance. Additionally, poor quality animal protein that has been raised in terribly inhumane and potentially unsafe conditions and eaten in excessive amounts has been linked to numerous chronic diseases. And again, this is about industrial agriculture. There is absolutely a place in the human diet in accordance with cultural relevance and other ideas around access for animals that are raised humanely and in a regenerative way. And then fish agriculture as well, which we didn't talk much about, but there can be impact on the ecosystems of the ocean and other waterways. But also there is potential for heavy metals to be higher in the fish that we are consuming now, and antibiotic resistance as a result of that. And farmed fish itself may be less healthy, lower in omega-3 fatty acids. And of course, for those indigenous communities who rely on salmon and rely on fish as a main source of protein, that is having a big impact on those communities who no longer have that same agency and governance over their own food supply. And lastly, soil. Soil plays a huge role already in resilience and resistance to the current climate crises that we are experiencing, like drought and flood. But as it relates to human health, soil health equals human health. When the soil is rich with nutrients, our plants, our food are rich with nutrients, and we in turn gain benefits as human beings who are being nourished. Soil that has been degraded or eroded actually has fewer phytochemicals in it. So those regenerative and organic practices, if possible, are going to really improve the health of the soil and thus improve the health of the human. And there's a very strong connection, which people don't often make, between the microbiome, all those wonderful bacteria that are just teeming in what should be the typical soil that we're growing food in. That microbiome of the soil has a direct impact to our own human gut microbiome, which we know has a profound influence on numerous components of our health systems. Next slide. So environmental health does equal human health. And luckily, very often, the very foods that we are trying to get our clients, our patients, our communities to eat more of, those plant foods, very often are the foods that have a much, much lower environmental footprint. And as it relates to health, these plant-based or plant-forward foods have been correlated with far less risk of those chronic diseases that we see, from coronary heart disease, colorectal cancer, type 2 diabetes, and of course, helping to reduce those greenhouse gases, as well as other environmental pollutants that are affecting people's health. And next. So it doesn't take that much. This is not about an all or nothing. Of course, anyone who wants to adopt a 100% vegan diet, absolutely, that is 100% anyone's decision. But even just replacing 50% of animal-based foods with plant-based foods can reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the United States by 35%. That is a significant number. And health practitioners can be an amazing bridge to help connect those dots between human health and environmental health and climate change. So it's actually the position, if we can go to the next piece here, of the Society of Nutrition, Education, and Behavior, that including environmental sustainability in our guidance is absolutely well within what we could and should and must be doing. So we know choices around diet are extraordinarily personal, but actually, many consumers are seeking out guidance, and they are believing that their healthcare practitioner is someone they can trust and go to for guidance. So incorporating environmental sustainability into that conversation is a welcome part of that dialogue that we have with patients and clients. Next slide. So I want to give you 10 simple ways that you can play a role as a nutrition professional. And again, these are just a few ideas. Number one is getting environmentalism into everything that you are doing, into your intake form. If you are teaching, invite having a conversation about the positive role that beans play on the environment as well as on health. If you are providing workshops or videos or podcasts, just get the idea of environmentalism, that conversation in there. Number two, anything we can do to encourage more plant-based, more plant-forward foods in our practices, in events, in communities with whom we work, any institution that we're involved with, restaurants, religious institutions. We need to demystify the bean. Very often people go, what the heck do I do with beans? That's where we can come in and say, I've got about 100 ideas for you, and they're fabulous. They taste fantastic. So recipes, photos of beautiful bean dishes, canned are okay. No one needs to soak their beans for 24 hours if that's going to be a deterrent. Engaging in Meatless Mondays, or having your institution or office sign on to the Cool Food Pledge. Number three, having any kind of visual is wonderful. Stephanie talked about normalizing. So visuals on your website, in your office, when people start to come back, on your tables, on your walls, things that help people to understand environmental footprints. Number 4, advocate for supporting local, organically grown, regeneratively grown, talking to farmers with your food, with your clients, your workplace. We want to support soil health and help to reduce any kind of chemical input, which we know has an impact on the environment and on our patients' health. Additionally, these kinds of systems very often will support animal welfare, although certainly not all of them do, but anything we can do to incorporate more promotion of these strategies for more eco-friendly farming is fantastic. Number 5, next slide. Encouraging growing our own food. This is something that has happened really in an incredible way over this past year with COVID. People are growing and starting their own gardens or supporting community gardens so that we can bring some of these more healthy foods into communities and marginalized areas where there are often food deserts or food apartheid is happening as a result of people just not having access. This provides agency and governance over food access as opposed to just handouts and food banks. Number 6, working with food brands. If you have an opportunity to work with a brand or a restaurant or a grocery store, number 7, to help make sure that their sustainability initiatives are being realized. And again, you can come in and make the argument for the health component. It is both sustainable and healthy for the person for whom we are serving. Number 8, if you are somebody who's on social media or writing articles or being quoted or creating blog posts, you have influence. You can offer your expertise and include the idea of more plant-based diets and more sustainable practices in everything that you're doing. Number 9, be vocal in federal and local policy as much as you can. As Stephanie was mentioning, the US dietary guidelines, and I imagine some of the other guidelines that are in different countries represented here on this webinar today, are very much disconnected with what we are producing. So we're producing 500% more meat than we are actually giving people guidance to consume. We're producing about half the amount of fruits and vegetables that we are encouraging people to eat on a regular basis. So there's a huge disconnect there, and we can be vocal around that policy as people in the nutrition profession as well. And lastly, number 10, just start conversations in your professional life, in your personal life, in your family. It can start small and it can wind up being quite extensive. Next slide. I want to just mention that this, there should be a top piece here, which looks like it's missing, which is when we talk about sustainable diets, they need to incorporate all of these pieces. So nutritional health, environmental and planetary health, economic benefit, and sociocultural components, which includes culturally appropriate and inclusive dietary guidelines, but also food sovereignty, welfare of farm workers, and animal welfare. And the last slide. These are just things you can ask yourself. What are you already doing? What have you thought about doing that maybe you aren't doing, but you could do? How could you see yourself as an agent for change in your personal and professional life? What is your sphere of influence? It may be bigger than you think. And lastly, what is one thing you could see yourself committing to doing this week, even if it's as soon as tomorrow? Thank you so much. Next slide, and I'm finished.
Amazing, Mary. It's always such a pleasure to hear you speak and such an informative talk. And thank you to Mary, Sujatha, and Stephanie for a fabulous, fabulous webinar today. We will go ahead and open it up to Q&A now. Bretta, I'm going to pass it off to you and you can just take over.
All right, if you guys have more questions, please go ahead and put those in the chat box. I'm going to go ahead and ask some of the questions that have been asked throughout the presentation. So one of our questions was, how do we shift dietary attitudes of people who regularly consume meat and or deny the threat of climate change?
I mean, I'm happy to start on that. I think, you know, to start with the climate change piece, from my perspective, there are so many reasons to shift the diet. I don't care why people do it. So I think one of the places to start with is find out what's important to the people you're talking to, whether that's on the individual level or you're talking to an institution. A lot of people are talking about climate change now, so especially on the institutional level, that's becoming a bigger deal. But for some people, it is still the health aspects that's going to be the leading concern. For some people, you know, as a wildlife organization, we get people who we get their attention when they start getting the connection between the future of wolves and meat and dairy production and consumption. So start from the point of finding what's important to them, find that common ground and work from there. And then you can employ some of the strategies that Sujatha was talking about, that it doesn't have to be a major shift. We're not telling everybody, go vegan this instant, right? We're talking about how do we reduce that meat and dairy consumption and start bringing in more plant-based foods. So there may be ways that are exploring other cuisines that are taking meat from the center of the plate and making it, you know, more of a condiment or more of a side dish and things like that make it easier, so it's not necessarily such a big, sudden, disruptive shift to people.
Fantastic, thank you. Does anyone else have anything they'd like to add to that?
Couldn't have said it better myself.
I would also say that I don't think climate deniers are our target audience. There's enough individuals out there who strongly believe that climate is an issue. And I would say stick with those people and give them those practical suggestions, and there's more likely to be buy-in there.
Perfect. All right. Our next question is, what can we do about getting plant-based foods to food deserts?
That's a good question. I know that there's been interest in, well, one thing is to figure out how to not have as many food deserts and to get investments of grocery stores and affordable places to buy food, healthy food into these places. But then one interesting initiative that I've heard of is an effort to get dollar stores to stock fresh produce. So these stores are in many places that major chains aren't, and well, they are a major chain, but they serve as they're in places often in food deserts, and so there are conversations happening in how to do that. So that's one strategy I've heard of.
There are also numerous urban gardens that are popping up. In Detroit, there is a wonderful documentary about all the urban gardens that people are creating and working with. And I think community gardens are just a fantastic way to begin to, again, not just bring the food in to have access, but to help people be involved in the actual process of growing their own food, of seeing where food comes from. So they're not just seeing it at a grocery store. They are actually involved with pulling that carrot out of the dirt and connecting to that and feeling a sense of agency. So I think anything we can do to support community gardens is a really wonderful way to get more of those plant-based foods into people's marginalized and less high income neighborhoods.
Perfect.
I think to build off that, this is a really great opportunity to work across different issues. Like we've done learning series before, working with food banks and local chefs and us as an environmental group to have these coordinated events where we're able to help people make the connections as well as teach them how to create these community gardens and how to grow the food and make that connection between all these different issues that are concerns to people. So I think really having a really strong, community-based strategy for it is important. In addition, of course, to that key point that Sujatha said is how do we as a society end food deserts? How do we end food apartheid and make sure that that's not an issue to start with?
Fantastic. And just a couple things that are going on in my community. There's a big push to get fresh produce into gas stations. And we are also part of the free fridge mutual aid movement as well. And so lots of people are bringing fresh fruits and vegetables to fridges that they've worked with local groups on having them outside of their shops where people can just come and pick up anything that they would like to that's in the fridge or the pantry that's out there. So yeah, awesome. All right, well, we've talked a lot about reducing meat consumption, and someone had the question asking about local meat and if that's more sustainable than maybe other sources of meat.
I can start us off, and I'm sure others have things to add. So the emissions associated with with meat come from a lot of different places, as Stephanie outlined. One of them is transportation. So if you're flying in shrimp from, I don't know, from Papua New Guinea to the United States, and that's a lot of transportation costs, emissions associated with transportation. But when you actually look at the overall life cycle of meat, most of the emissions are actually not associated with transport. It's actually associated with all of the things that Stephanie talked about, the feed that's grown to feed the animal, the methane, if it's the cow or a sheep that's emitted, the manure, those are where all the emissions come from. The vast majority of emissions come from. And so eating local actually just cuts off a little bit. So it's if you're looking to have the biggest impact, it's better to shift to plants than to eat local meat. I don't know if you have anything to add, Stephanie.
No, I mean, that's really the core answer. There are details that we could get into about, for the amount of meat you are eating, what should you look for and what should be part of that. But really the key thing is that from an emission standpoint, the amount of meat makes much more difference than where it's coming from.
Having said that, if you're going to eat meat, then eat local. Sure, that's great.
Yeah, and I mean, it's another way to connect with your farmer to understand how those animals were treated, how the animals were grown, what they were fed, and that may also have implications for the health of that animal's, not only their life, but the health of their meat and the nutrition benefits. But I'm in concurrence with them about just reducing meat consumption overall, but the better meat is always the better choice, if possible.
Perfect. All right. So our next question is related to maybe the impact of some of our plant-based protein sources. So someone had asked in regards to the Amazon's deforestation / agriculture impacts of soy and palm, are there strategies to avoid increasing demand for soy and palm while increasing soy-based proteins and vegan products with palm?
I am not familiar with a lot of the issues around palm oil, so I don't feel qualified to speak to that. I know that there's a whole vibrant community that works on it. I don't know, Stephanie, if you are more familiar than I am. I can speak to soy. So soy in the Amazon in particular. There are European and British and United Kingdom based retailers that are talking about bans on products that are leading to deforestation in the Amazon. And so that would be a very effective strategy. So Tesco has been talking about that, as well as Sainsbury's. In addition, there's a trade agreement called Mercosur that many European countries are looking at signing with Latin American countries, including Brazil, and Germany and France have raised concerns about signing that deal if Brazil, if they can't get a handle on deforestation associated with some of these agricultural commodities. So government levers, market levers are the levers that I'm most excited about.
Yeah, we don't work on the palm oil issue, but like Sujatha said, there are a lot of groups that work on it. And that one's really tricky because that's a really hidden ingredient for a lot of people, and it's become so pervasive in snack foods. But to focus on the soy question, I think the other thing to keep in mind is that the vast majority of soy is going to feed livestock right now. So even with an increase in soy going to plant-based foods, it's actually displacing a huge chunk of the soy that's being used for livestock. So ultimately, it would result in less soy being grown. But the other piece too is that there's a massive amount of innovation going on around plant-based protein. That no longer means just soy. Like Sujatha was mentioning, the burger that McDonald's is using is based on the Beyond Burger, and they use a pea-based protein. And I know that these companies, Beyond and Impossible and others, are constantly looking for what are alternative sources of protein, because ultimately they realize that relying on a monocrop like soy will create a long-term vulnerability for them as well. So they're really looking for ways to, to open up the market, to be more sustainable, and to, to think about all of the other ways that there are other proteins out there that might be better for the environment and ultimately better for their products and better for the taste, and be able to appeal to more consumers who may be worried about soy, whether it's from a health or an allergy or an environmental perspective.
Perfect, thank you. I think we have time for one more question, and the questions that we didn't get to, we'll make sure that we answer them on another format, but just to be respectful of everyone's time and getting out of here on time. I do have a question from one of our students on how they can get involved. So the question is, I'm a student at a public high school. In what ways can I help incorporate these plant-based initiatives into our school?
That's awesome. I think it's your generation that's going to be leading on these issues. So it's great that you're representing folks that are looking to start working on these issues early in life. One thing you can do is talk to your campus, your principal, folks who run your dining hall, and see if they're interested in moving to including more plant-based options or plant-forward options in the cafeteria. You could introduce a Meatless Monday or some equivalent. And if you have administrators that are a little skeptical of the demand, you can demonstrate that there is a lot of interest by getting a bunch of your friends to sign a letter. So there are things that you can do locally on your college campus as one idea. Not college campus, sorry, high school campus.
Yeah, I agree. And there are a lot of strategies where you can get the community involved if your administration is providing a lot of pushback. Getting the other students to sign on, like Sujatha said, even getting people to get their parents to sign on. A lot of times that's a pushback that happens with schools, is they think there's going to be resistance from parents. You can get health practitioners, folks on this call who you're interacting with, people who are nutrition experts, to send a letter on the benefits of this. There are just a lot of ways to really demonstrate to your administration that this is something that is in high demand, that people want, and that's better for overall health. There are also some good examples out there that show that it can ultimately save the school money too. So sometimes that can be really convincing for them.
Fantastic. Thank you all for all the questions. Like I said, we will be saving all of your questions, and we'll find another way to answer them, especially those who are asking about book recommendations. We will probably do an entire Instagram series on books that you can purchase or loan from your library and get a really good feel for this topic as a whole. But for now, we'll move on to close out this meeting. So I'm going to send a few different ways to get involved with the Planetary Health Collective to the chat, so you can check that out. Please check out our website, which is planetaryhealthcollective.org. We have blog posts up there, and we'll be covering a wide variety of topics. We try and post a new article weekly. If you're interested in being more involved or contributing to our blog, you can apply to be a writer. We also have other leadership positions open, and you can find the application link in the chat message that I sent. Please join us on our Facebook group. That's actually where we engage the most, and we have a growing community over there on Facebook. And then on Instagram as well, we're putting out information almost daily. So if you haven't already, don't forget to fill out the survey in the chat, and you'll be eligible to win some of our sustainable kitchen items. Keep in mind, though, if you're an international guest today, we're so happy to have you, and we would love your feedback on the survey. We just won't be able to ship internationally at this point, but please fill out the survey, and we'd love to have you. If you guys have any other questions, feel free to reach out to us at hello@planetaryhealthcollective.org. And thank you so much to Stephanie, Sujatha, and Mary for speaking with us today. It was fantastic.
Amazing. Thank you all so much for coming out. We appreciate you so much. If you have not yet, please head over to our Eventbrite page. Follow us at the Planetary Health Collective on Eventbrite if you loved this webinar and you want to join us for one similar to this one in the future. Please don't be shy about reaching out to us over email, Instagram, or Facebook to learn how you can get more involved with the Planetary Health Collective. And before you leave for the day, let us know one action that you're going to take this week to actualize some of the things that we discussed today during our session. Amazing. Thank you all so much. Let's see. I know for one, I'm going to be working on my plant-based menu for the week. I've been trying to incorporate more plants and less meat over the course of the last year, and I'm down to a place where I'm having red meat maybe once or twice a month. But growing up in a Turkish household, that was something that was much more common on a more frequent basis. So that's one personal change that I've been working towards making. We have some folks saying that they'll be discussing with their parents how to reduce the amount of meat products that their family eats. Amazing, amazing idea. Another person is saying that they will order a Beyond Burger at the school dining hall. Love that. Samantha is making a big veggie soup right now, and she's going to cut out meat at least 1 or 2 days a week. I love it. Dana is working on getting her husband to cut meat and dairy. Amazing. I love it. Thank you guys all so much. If you think of anything else that you would like to see from us in terms of educational resources, webinars, all of that, we are all ears. Please fill out that survey, and thank you all so much for attending. Have a great night.